So 40k game balance has had its ups and downs over the past few years, but today we're resurrecting some old abominations with 4 broken rules combos from 40k's past. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a few of the weirdest and most exploited rules in Warhammer 40k, all long dead and buried from previous editions from the game. While game balance in 8th and 9th edition hasn't always been particularly healthy, I'd argue that for the most part Games Workshop has done a fairly good job of keeping incredibly stupid rules interactions from truly destroying things, or at least FAQing them relatively quickly afterwards. There's honestly quite a lot to choose from going past, and I'm sure we could do a second video like this if you guys have some more ideas down in the comments. But today we're just going to talk about 4 of the most notable examples of broken rules that made for some incredibly silly and potentially very unbalanced games of 40k. The examples I've chosen all seem to be chaos, weirdly enough. That wasn't intentional or anything. I think just maybe with the large amount of psychic powers and focus on big synergy units that chaos usually has, it often tends to be the place where the game's designers mess up in a really big way. There's a fair bit of the armies either being fairly tame or getting some unit combos together which kind of break the game. In any case, let's start with an older example in Lash of Submission. So I believe that this particular psychic power was at its height around about between 3rd and 5th edition 40k, and it was basically a psychic power to allow you to move your opponent's non-vehicle models 2d6 inches in a direction of your choice. From 8th edition onwards, there's almost no rules in the game that allow you to move your opponent's models in any way whatsoever, and Lash of Submission is a perfect example why. Back in those days, you had to pay points cost for your psychic powers. You could take multiple copies of them, and this was frequently run on Slaneshi Demon Princes, which in themselves were fairly decent melee fighters too, so it's just a very scary all-round pick. Basically moving your opponent's units gives you massive advantages in game, but perhaps the silliest example in this era was combining it with blast templates, where you could basically condense a unit with Lash of Submission to fit in all really bunched up, and then drop a whole load of blast templates on them, either small blasts from things like plasma cannons from Obliterators, or large blasts from Vindicators. These were physical circular templates for those who have only played 8th edition onwards. Usually the small blasts could only cover maybe 1 or 2 models if you were lucky and your opponent spread out, but if you managed to condense a unit with Lash of Submission and have them all queue up perfectly for the blast template, a small blast could easily hit 7 or so models. It could just allow you to demolish enemy infantry units with incredible ease. On top of that, it could be incredibly frustrating for melee units. Most units in the game would move 6 inches back in this edition, you couldn't advance or anything, which meant that you could basically just repeatedly move their unit away and keep them out of the game the entire game long, as they could never get any closer to you. On the opposite side, it could make your own charges incredibly easy, waltzing an enemy unit out of cover to take a charge from your nasty melee hitters, and you could also use it to move people straight off objectives as well. So at the end of the game, your opponent might be scoring 1 or 2 less objectives than they would have otherwise expected to. Overall, I think it's probably for the best that a design decision in 8th edition seems to be that you can't move your opponent's models under virtually any circumstances. There just don't seem to be all that many ways to write that kind of rule without it being open to some sort of horrible abuse. Next up, we come to the dreaded Screamer Star. I believe that this was a creation of either late 6th edition 40k or early 7th, and what you do as a Chaos Demon player would be take 3 Heralds on discs, alongside a large unit of Screamers for some good movement and a bit of melee threat. In 7th edition, the Demons of Tzeentch could re-roll saves of 1, and Games Workshop hadn't realised that you probably shouldn't let people stack Invul saves to the stars, so you could combine the Psychic Power 4 warning for a 4+ Invul save, then use Cursed Earth to make it to a 3+, and then have 1 Herald use the Grimoire of True Names. That was a book that gave them an extra +1 to their Invul save on a 3+, which you could re-roll with one of your Tzeentch re-rolls. Basically all of those combined to make a unit with a 2+ re-rollable Invul save, so no matter what sort of damage you put on them, only 1 out of every 36 shots is likely to get through and inflicts damage on the unit. It was an era before anything like mortal wounds were a thing, and maybe the Screamer Star stands out as it was perhaps one of the first really nasty Death Star combos that came out, that spiraled into increasing silliness throughout 7th edition. Towards the end, I think you could get multiple units that were very similar like this, or just using invisibility or ludicrously tanky characters to make sure the squad didn't suffer any damage. The Screamer Star wasn't really without its limitations. It was basically a fast and almost unkillable unit that didn't do enormous damage output for the points investors. Potentially it could be countered by Titanic units rolling a 6 on a stomp, which could auto-remove a bunch of models if they got lucky, or potentially being tar-pitted by other very hard to remove units. Still though, it was really quite cheap to field for the points cost, and I'm glad that at least in contemporary 40k you don't have units running around with a 2+ invul save that you can re-roll. For all the faults of 8th and 9th edition, I'm glad that Games Workshop have agreed that that's basically a bad thing. Next up we have an 8th edition list. It was fairly briefly a thing after the Death Guard Codex dropped, but it did get FAQ'd after a few months. It basically came by abusing a few stratagem options in the Death Guard and Chaos Space Marine army list, and it basically gave you a horde that grows at the same rate as the enemy manages to kill models, if not potentially even more. In the Death Guard Codex at the start of 8th edition, Poxwalkers' reanimation rule was that if a model of any sort dies within 6 inches, then you could add 1 extra Poxwalker to the unit, even if it took you above the unit's starting size. It meant that provided enough enemies die, the Poxwalker unit could get incredibly large indeed, and just gum up all the board and steal all the objectives. This meant that what you could do was surround an enormous unit of Poxwalkers with a whole bunch of Chaos Cultists, make sure the Cultists are all within at least 6 inches of at least 1 Poxwalker, and then every Cultist that dies will be reanimated as a glorious Nurgly zombie. Every time you shot dead a Cultist, you were essentially just upgrading the model, because Poxwalkers cost more than Cultists, and were generally harder to remove with their disgustingly resilient, and you could use a psychic power to get their toughness up to 5. Now the obvious solution would be just to shoot the Poxwalkers and not the Cultists, and make sure you kill that unit before you kill anything else. But the Death Guard have the Cloud of Fire stratagem, which you could use to make the Poxwalkers completely untargetable unless their unit was the closest. It essentially gave you the situation where your opponent was faced by a massive horde of Cultists with some Poxwalkers in the middle. They couldn't shoot the Poxwalkers, so you'd have to shoot the Cultists, making the Poxwalker unit grow even bigger. Then, just in case that wasn't enough, if you managed to injure any Chaos Cultist units but not completely destroy them, you could then regenerate the entire Cultist unit using Tide of Traitors, and have another really big unit turn up on the side of the board. Say you could have a shooting phase where your army kills something like 25 Cultists, they become another 25 Poxwalkers, then next turn the Chaos player uses Tide of Traitors on the Cultists and regenerates another 25 Cultists. Basically, you could have a full turn of shooting into the army and wind up facing more models and better models than when you started. You could also do something very similar with horrors as well, abusing their split rules, which would also technically generate a Poxwalker every time the models split. So each horror could generate you up to 5 Poxwalkers as well before the unit was shot down. You did need the reinforcement points for the splitting horrors though, but that really wasn't the worst price to pay. Basically in any sort of objective game, you could just walk onto the objectives and win, and maybe have a few hidden damage dealers in the middle of the army, things like Psychers for Smite or Demon Princes perhaps, just so you had a little bit of big punching threat that couldn't be directly targeted. I believe Games Workshop decided to kill this by having the Poxwalkers only regenerate models if they actually slay them in close combat themselves, rather than resurrecting within 6 inches, which is probably for the best rather than being faced with this very demoralizing horde of endless chaos. Finally, we're returning back to 7th again, and we're talking about the Tzeentch Demon summoning engine, where theoretically with enough Psychers abusing the summoning mechanics, you could have a game of 40k sort of play like a demon incursion would happen in the actual 40k galaxy, where once you've got enough Chaos Demons coming through the portals, it's basically unstoppable, and they just keep on summoning and charging in more and more and more, where if you don't stop them very early, then they could be summoning entire 2,000 point armies to the board by the end of the game. Basically, by the end of 7th edition, you didn't have to pay any points cost for summon units coming in. All you had to do was cast a fairly high warp charge psychic power. The most efficient way to just spam warp charge dice onto the board was just to spam an absolute massive amount of Tzeentch Heralds, and there was an easy detachment to field absolutely tons of those and get some minor bonuses in addition. At the start of the game, you'd have to start with a ridiculous amount of admin, as each herald would have to determine its spells from the summoning discipline randomly, and then you'd see which spells they'd generate, whether they were able to create more heralds, upgrade themselves to greater demons, or just summon in standard lesser demons into the board in waves. I think if you really went high on the stratagem and spammed as many heralds as possible, plus a bunch of pink horrors just to protect them, you could potentially be averaging 5 or 6 free new units per turn, and every herald that knew the sacrifice power could quite easily rustle up extra heralds for a very low warp charge cost indeed, at the expense of one friendly model. So potentially your list could summon in a crazy amount of points of demons, and also potentially increase its warp charge throughout the course of the game and gain access to more spells with the new summon heralds. And then when you do fancy going all out aggressive, instead of summoning units, a bunch of heralds could just upgrade themselves to greater demons like bloodthirsters, and potentially have 3 or 4 of them just charge straight into the enemy. Basically, if you didn't manage to kill a significant amount of the heralds and the units turn 1, your army is almost certainly going to get buried under a never-ending horde of summoned demons. I think the main limit here was the actual collection of the player who's summoning the models in question, and I guess if you ever did want to run this in real life, you'd be turning up to a game with a crazy amount of models in tow, which I'm no doubt probably gave the Demon's army a bit of a sales boost in 7th with that free summoning. When we went into 8th edition and you had to pay points for any summoned models, you just had the flexibility of choosing which would come in. I think very few people were really that sorry to see this sort of stupidity go away. So anyway, there's a brief overview of 4 of the most broken rules throughout 40k's history. I'm sure there's absolutely tons more that I could potentially cover, so if you have any other examples you'd like me to talk about, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. These just happen to be a few of the ones that I found the most interesting. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the content coming regularly, with new 40k videos out near enough every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page if you'd like to help keep them coming. You can find that down in the video description below, and I do try and offer some nice benefits for being a member, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.